The courtroom stared at me like a monster who waited for her father to be hospitalized just to steal the family empire. Under oath, my own parents pointed right at me, swearing I forged signatures to orchestrate a hostile takeover. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I stayed silent because I knew the final person walking through those doors would completely shatter the lie my family built to bury me alive. My name is Faith Crawford. I am 39 years old, and I am currently the most hated woman in the state of Ohio. The courtroom felt like a meat locker. The air conditioning hummed a low, relentless drone that rattled against the high oak-paneled walls. I stood perfectly straight beside the defense table. Every eye in the gallery burned into the back of my neck. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the greedy daughter to finally collapse under the weight of her own sins. The charge was corporate theft on a massive scale, specifically the hostile takeover of West Haven Relief Network. That was the medical logistics empire my family built from the ground up over 3 decades. It was a company designed to save lives during crises by rushing emergency supplies to disaster zones. Now it was the battleground where my family was executing me in broad daylight. The heavy mahogany tables felt rough under my fingertips. Dust motes drifted through the sharp shafts of afternoon sunlight cutting across the room. The local reporters filled the back 2 rows. Their pens scratched furiously across their notepads. They loved this narrative. The prodigal daughter returning only to plunge a knife into the backs of her aging parents. I could feel the hostile energy radiating from the jury box. 12 strangers had already decided my guilt before the first piece of paper was even entered into the record. They saw my tailored charcoal suit and my rigid posture as pure arrogance. They saw a ruthless corporate raider disguised as family. Leonard Crawford placed his right hand on the worn leather cover of the Bible. My father. The man who taught me how to read a corporate balance sheet before I even entered high school. His voice echoed through the silent room. It was thinner now, weaker than I remembered. He was still recovering from severe cardiovascular surgery. His face was pale and the skin around his jaw hung loose, but his eyes were completely devoid of warmth when he looked at me. He swore to tell the truth. And then he began to lie with a conviction that shattered whatever remained of my heart. He told the court that I had weaponized his illness. He described the agonizing weeks he spent in the intensive care unit fighting for his life. While he was hooked up to heart monitors and breathing tubes, he claimed I was busy dismantling his legacy. He testified that I drafted unauthorized addendums in the dead of night. He swore I altered the foundational voting rights of the executive board. He told the jury I systematically transferred controlling shares into dummy accounts under my direct supervision. Every word he spoke was a meticulously crafted dagger aimed at my throat. He played the part of the heartbroken patriarch perfectly. His voice broke at exactly the right moments. The jury absorbed his manufactured sorrow and turned it into righteous rage against me. I listened to the man who gave me my name drag it through the mud. I felt the cold leather of my chair pressing against my legs, but I did not sit down. I watched his hands tremble on the witness stand. I knew those tremors were genuine. The massive surgery had taken a terrible toll on his physical health, but the words coming out of his mouth were fed to him by someone else. He was a tragic puppet reciting a script he barely understood, but wholeheartedly believed because the alternative was too horrifying for him to accept. Then came my mother. Diane Crawford took the stand next. She wore a simple dark blue dress, designed to make her look fragile and exhausted. She did not look at me, not even for a fraction of a second. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the witness box. She was the emotional anchor of their brutal legal strategy. My father provided the structural accusations, but my mother provided the devastating emotional blow that would seal my fate. She choked back tears as she confirmed the digital trail of my supposed treason. She identified the digital signatures on the emergency corporate resolutions. She told the solemn judge that every single document stripping them of their lifelong work bore the unmistakable electronic mark of Faith Crawford. She wept openly. She sobbed about how they had trusted me, how they had welcomed me back into the fold after years of distance only to find a venomous viper in their nest. The court reporter typed rhythmically, capturing every broken syllable for the official transcript. The jury looked at her with profound pity. A few of them glared at me with unadulterated disgust. The narrative was permanently cemented in their minds. I was the cold and ungrateful child who looked at her vulnerable parents and saw nothing but dollar signs and power. I did not cry. I did not shout. I did not slam my fists on the table or object to the blatant perjury unfolding before my eyes. I maintained a posture so rigidly calm that the air around me felt entirely frozen. Naomi Bell sat directly beside me. She was my lead defense attorney and a seasoned veteran of countless brutal corporate litigations, but even she looked at me with deep, unsettling confusion. She leaned in close and whispered, asking if I needed a recess to compose myself. I simply shook my head. A single slight motion. No, let them finish. Let them put every single magnificent lie on the permanent official record. The plaintiff legal team moved in for the final kill. They wheeled in heavy metal carts, loaded with white bankers' boxes. They presented a massive mountain of physical and digital evidence designed to bury me so deep I would never see the light of day again. They displayed massive projected slides of electronic signature logs, highlighting my name in bright red ink. They handed out thick stapled copies of the forged board minutes. They entered the family trust addendums into the court registry. They presented the voting rights transfer orders, page after page, file after file. The timeline they constructed looked absolutely flawless. The documentation looked pristine and legally binding. To the untrained eye, it was an ironclad case. It looked exactly like the work of a brilliant malicious insider who knew all the dark blind spots in the West Haven compliance system. Every single piece of paper pointed directly at me like a loaded gun ready to fire. The room grew incredibly heavy with the sheer volume of my alleged crimes. The lead prosecutor walked back to his desk with a smug expression of absolute certain victory. The gallery muttered in low, angry tones. The local reporters were already drafting their sensational headlines for the evening editions. Daughter steals medical empire, while father fights for his life. It was a perfect, devastating story. Right at that very second when my total defeat seemed like an undeniable reality, the heavy wooden side door of the courtroom creaked open. A young court clerk slipped into the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, breaking the suffocating thick tension. She walked briskly up the short wooden side steps and approached the massive elevated bench. The judge leaned down slightly. The clerk covered her mouth with her hand and whispered something urgent directly into the ear of the presiding judge. The judge straightened up slowly. His expression shifted rapidly from practiced neutrality to profound annoyance and then finally to sharp, intense curiosity. He looked over the thin metal rim of his glasses. He stared directly at the heavy double doors at the very back of the courtroom. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead ventilation system. You could hear the synchronized breathing of 50 people suddenly holding their breath, waiting for the next strike of the wooden gavel. The plaintiff attorneys looked highly confused. My parents exchanged a frantic, deeply nervous glance. The judge raised his wrinkled hand, signaling an immediate pause in the proceedings. He did not order the armed bailiff to open the doors immediately. He did not announce who was waiting on the other side of the heavy wood. The air in the room crackled with raw, intense electrical tension. I remained standing tall. My breathing was slow and perfectly measured. I looked at my father, who was suddenly gripping the wooden rail in front of him so hard his knuckles turned white. I looked at my mother, who had stopped crying instantly and was now staring at the back doors with wide, panicked, fearful eyes. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of flawless, perfect paperwork. They thought thin sheets of paper were stronger than thick blood. They did not understand why I had allowed them to speak uninterrupted for hours. They did not realize that I desperately needed them to commit their tragic perjury to the permanent legal record. I needed the massive, beautiful lie to be fully constructed before I brought a heavy steel sledgehammer to its fragile foundations. To understand how I could stand there with absolute ice in my veins while the two people who gave me life tried to actively destroy it, you have to look back. You have to understand what West Haven Relief Network really was behind the polished glass doors. You have to look past the pristine, charitable public facade and see the black rot eating away at the wooden floorboards. You have to go back to the exact day I first walked back into that corporate building, completely foolishly thinking I was there to save them. My parents started with one used delivery van and a heavy two-way radio. It was the early 90s in a rough industrial park on the edge of Cleveland. They ran basic medical supplies like sterile gauze, saline bags, and bulk surgical gloves to independent regional clinics scattered around the Rust Belt. I grew up doing my homework on top of stacked cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of industrial antiseptic and packing tape. That small, gritty hustle morphed into West Haven Relief Network. By the time I graduated from high school, West Haven was no longer just delivering simple boxes. They were building highly complex predictive supply chain software for massive hospital networks, outfitting vast long-term care facilities, and coordinating rapid emergency logistics for state disaster response teams. It was a true American dream built on relentless sweat, missed family dinners, and strategic timing. I am the eldest child, but I was never the golden heir apparent. I was always too rigid for the fluid nature of the family business. I cared deeply about absolute rules, exact numbers, and hard, unforgiving truths. I did not possess the soft diplomatic skills required to charm angry regional vendors over expensive steak dinners or schmooze local politicians at lavish charity galas. I simply could not smile at people I did not trust. So I left. I moved out the exact moment I finished my accounting degree and built my own independent life far away from my father and his towering, suffocating expectations. I spent over 15 years working at Palisade Review Group in Chicago. We were a quiet private consultancy specializing purely in corporate contract fraud and forensic auditing. I made a very comfortable living dissecting bloated operational budgets and hunting down phantom vendors hiding behind complex corporate veils. I bought my own brick townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. I fully funded my own independent retirement accounts. I paid for my own life. I did not need or want a single dime from the Crawford Family Trust. That was the bitter irony the jury could not see. Why would a woman who spent her entire adult life aggressively securing her own financial independence suddenly decide to return home and rob her aging parents blind? It defied all basic logic. My younger brother Nolan took the exact opposite path. Nolan stayed right at home. He possessed a terrifyingly natural ability to tell people exactly what they desperately wanted to hear. He had the perfect easy smile, the perfect effortless golf swing, and the exact brand of charismatic flexibility my parents absolutely adored. He knew how to order the right expensive wine at dinner and how to make my mother laugh when the stress of the business grew too heavy. To them, Nolan was the one who truly understood the beating heart and soul of the family business. He navigated the murky gray areas of rapid corporate expansion with ease, while I was busy miles away strictly policing the black and white borders of other people's companies. The real trouble started when West Haven expanded far too rapidly for its own foundation to support. The last 5 years brought massive sudden influxes of government emergency supply grants. Federal and state money poured in like a violent flash flood. When a company grows that incredibly fast, the internal architecture almost always fractures under the extreme pressure. West Haven bloated practically overnight. Suddenly, there were over a dozen new subsidiary limited liability companies, endless confusing layers of external subcontracting, highly ambiguous third-party consulting fees, and a sprawling tangled web of new regional suppliers I had never even heard of before. The foundational compliance framework that my father had built decades ago was completely overwhelmed by the sheer unprecedented volume of cash moving through their digital systems on a daily basis. The fateful call came on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. My mother sounded incredibly small and exhausted over the phone. She told me my father was starting to fail physically. His heart simply could not handle the extreme stress of the upcoming quarterly corporate audits. She begged me to come back home just for a little while. She said Nolan was completely buried under the macro finance restructuring, and they desperately needed someone they could implicitly trust to untangle the increasingly messy operational books. She framed it entirely as a temporary family favor. She made it sound like I was just a good daughter coming back to help her aging parents sweep the dusty floors of the old family store for a few passing months. I did not return to Ohio to claim a corporate throne. I went back acting as a seasoned firefighter stepping willingly into a smoking building. I accepted a temporary localized role as the Senior Director of Compliance Review. I packed exactly 2 large suitcases and leased a small sterile corporate apartment just 3 miles from the headquarters. I genuinely believed I would spend maybe 6 to 8 months reformatting their broken vendor vetting protocols, implementing a secure modern digital ledger, and then I would pack my bags and go right back to my quiet, predictable life at Palisade. I walked through the towering sliding glass doors of the West Haven Executive Building fully believing I was simply going to organize some messy filing cabinets and update their software. The new headquarters was a breathtaking monument to massive new corporate wealth. The main lobby featured soaring walls of imported Italian marble and a stunning indoor waterfall that echoed softly across the pristine, polished floors. It was impeccably clean and smelled of expensive citrus air freshener. But the very moment I swiped my newly printed temporary employee badge and walked onto the actual operational administrative floors, the air felt completely different. It is a very specific primal instinct you develop after spending over a decade successfully hunting corporate fraud. You learn how to smell quiet, desperate fear disguised as bustling efficiency. The place was simply too shiny. The junior executives were far too polite when they walked past my office door. Everyone smiled, just a little too widely, and spoke just a little too fast when I introduced myself as the new compliance director. It felt exactly like walking into a massive, beautiful old house that had just been aggressively painted with thick, heavy coats of premium white paint just to mask the toxic black mold rapidly eating away at the foundational wooden beams inside the walls. I sat down at my new heavy mahogany desk, opened the very first quarter vendor expenditure file, and immediately felt a cold, heavy knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. The operational numbers were all technically balanced on the surface, but the profound silence between the data points was screaming at me. Something was deeply, horribly wrong in my family house, and they had just willingly handed me the keys to the locked basement. I began where any forensic accountant begins. I started at the very bottom of the ledger. Corporate fraud rarely announces itself with a marching band and flashing lights. It creeps in slowly through the mundane, everyday operating expenses. My first week back at the company was spent drowning in standard general ledger readouts from the previous 4 quarters. I sat alone in my temporary office long after the sunset, staring at endless rows of digital spreadsheets. I looked closely at the external warehousing invoices. They had jumped by 22% over a single 18-month period. The brief explanation attached to the file was a generic typed note about regional price inflation and expanded supply chain demands. Then I found the route optimization fees. They were billed exactly every 90 days like clockwork. $48,000 here, $62,000 there, sometimes $75,000 right before the close of a fiscal year. They were always paid out to external consulting firms with names that sounded incredibly professional, but meant absolutely nothing in the real world. Money does not just evaporate into thin air. It simply learns how to wear a different set of clothes and walk out the front door. I isolated 3 specific vendor files from the massive stack: Ashmere Advisory, Pine Meridian Storage, Hollow Bridge Logistics. They all shared the same pristine, polished corporate structure. They possessed perfectly formatted tax identification numbers and crisp, clean digital invoices. But when I dug past the beautiful surface, there was zero substance underneath. I ran a deep cross-reference check on their registered business addresses using public municipal databases. 2 of those companies tracked back to identical commercial mailboxes located in a dying strip mall 20 miles outside of Columbus. The third company belonged to a virtual office space that rented meeting rooms by the hour to freelance workers. I pulled their employee identification records from the state registry. They had virtually zero actual human personnel on payroll. No warehouse managers, no logistics coordinators, no drivers. Yet West Haven was funneling substantial capital into their corporate accounts every single month. None of the individual wire transfers were large enough to trigger an automatic executive board review. They always stayed right under the $250,000 threshold. But when I aggregated the payments across a rolling 2-year timeline, the picture became horrifying. Millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of our primary operating accounts. The money was washing through multiple intermediary layers like water, moving through a complex series of hidden pipes. It was a masterpiece of parasitic financial engineering designed specifically to keep the internal warning sirens completely silent. The phantom companies were only the first layer of the rot. The mechanism used to approve those payments was far more disturbing. West Haven relied heavily on a secure enterprise digital signature protocol. It was meant to streamline executive approvals across our rapidly expanding national footprint. I started pulling the raw timestamp data on the electronic signature authorization packets. I noticed a distinct pattern of asynchronous approvals. High-level purchase orders for Ashmere Advisory were being cryptographically signed at 3 a.m. local time. I cross-referenced those specific login sessions against the corporate travel itineraries of the approving executives. The data completely fractured under scrutiny. One regional operations director supposedly signed off on a massive logistics contract from a secure computer terminal located in our Ohio headquarters. However, his official expense reports proved he was actively attending an industry conference in Seattle, Washington at that exact moment. The geographic locations and the digital access logs were living in two completely different realities. I decided to test the waters carefully. I took my initial questions down to the centralized records department on the second floor. I kept my tone casually inquisitive. I asked the shift supervisor to clarify the server routing protocols for out-of-state digital approvals. The supervisor immediately stiffened. His posture became rigid. He avoided my eyes and gave me a tangled, rehearsed answer about recent server migrations causing minor timestamp glitches across the network. He practically pushed me out of his office while claiming he had a massive backlog of files to process. I decided to take a different angle. I walked down the main hall and caught my brother pouring coffee in the executive lounge. I leaned against the marble counter and casually mentioned the recurring consulting fees being paid to Ashmere Advisory. I watched his face carefully. Nolan did not flinch. He did not miss a single beat. He offered a lightning-fast, brilliant smile. He told me Ashmere was a boutique risk assessment firm doing highly specialized predictive modeling for our new government contracts. His explanation was impossibly smooth. It was far too perfectly rehearsed for a casual morning conversation over coffee. He patted me on the shoulder and told me not to get bogged down in the minor administrative weeds. He said the macro picture was all that mattered right now. Later that afternoon, I was standing alone by the heavy commercial printers at the far end of the compliance hallway. A woman approached me quietly. She held a thick stack of blank copy paper against her chest like a protective shield. Her name was Lena Morales. She was the senior data retention manager for our internal network. I had seen her name on several key system architecture documents. She looked around the empty corridor with a tense, nervous energy. She stepped uncomfortably close to me and kept her voice barely above a whisper. She told me to stop looking at the external routing logs. She said the internal signature system was not remotely as clean as I thought it was. Her dark eyes were wide and filled with a raw, desperate kind of fear. She begged me never to mention her name to anyone in the executive suite. She said people who asked too many questions about the digital ledgers tended to face sudden restructuring. Before I could ask a single follow-up question, she turned and walked rapidly down the hall, disappearing into the concrete stairwell. I did not run straight to the board of directors. I did not storm into my father's corner office and slam a massive stack of printed spreadsheets onto his desk. I am a professional hunter of corporate lies. I know exactly what happens when you corner a desperate predator before you have built a strong enough cage. They panic, and they immediately destroy the evidence. So I nodded politely in the hallways. I smiled at my brother during our weekly departmental meetings, and I went to work deep in the shadows. I spent my nights quietly exporting massive data sets onto encrypted external hard drives. I manually backed up the vendor reconciliation tables. I mapped out the entire digital approval history for the last 36 months. I charted the impossible login locations and the asynchronous timestamp discrepancies. I built a massive silent arsenal of hard, undeniable data. I was no longer the helpful daughter sorting out some messy administrative files to help her sick father. I had stepped directly onto a massive rotting floorboard in the very center of my family empire. I was dealing with a deeply entrenched system of theft that was totally insulated by the blinding power of familial trust. And the architects of that system were about to realize I was standing right in the middle of their carefully constructed web. 72 hours. That was exactly how long it took for the invisible walls to close in around me. I arrived at my desk on a crisp Thursday morning and turned on my monitor. I typed my credentials into the centralized authentication portal. I needed to verify a batch of routing numbers associated with the Columbus warehouses. The screen loaded for exactly 3 seconds before flashing a solid red banner. Access denied. Error code 704, security restructuring in progress. I tried the secondary database. Access denied. I tried the archived vendor ledgers from the previous fiscal year. Access denied. My network footprint had been systematically stripped down to the absolute bare minimum. I could read the weekly cafeteria menu, and I could access the public corporate directory. The core financial archives were completely sealed off from my terminal. The invisible machine was moving against me rapidly. I walked straight to the executive suites on the top floor. I found Nolan leaning over his polished glass desk reviewing a massive marketing proposal. I told him my administrative privileges had been abruptly revoked. He looked up with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a magnificent piece of acting. His eyebrows shot up and he immediately reached for his heavy desk phone. He told me it had to be a technical glitch from the new enterprise software rollout. He promised me he would personally call the information technology director and have it sorted out before lunch. He practically tripped over his own words, trying to assure me that everything was fine. But I saw the microscopic tightening around the corners of his mouth. I heard the forced high pitch in his voice. He was far too eager to play the helpful younger brother. It was the frantic, hyperactive energy of a cornered animal trying to distract a predator. He was terrified because he knew I was looking in the dark corners, and he desperately needed to blind me before I found the main switch. I left his office and took the back stairwell down to the lobby. The concrete steps echoed with a cold, hollow sound. Halfway down the 3rd flight of stairs, I heard the heavy fire door creak open above me. Quick, soft footsteps hurried down the concrete. It was Lena Morales. She did not look at me. She walked right past me on the landing and brushed her shoulder violently against mine. A small, tightly folded square of yellow paper dropped from her hand directly into my palm. She kept walking down the stairs without breaking her rapid stride. She spoke into the empty, echoing stairwell, keeping her voice painfully thin. She said the primary network was compromised, and they were building a narrative to burn me to the ground. She told me to look at the slip of paper. She said it was the hardware serial number of a redundant backup server. She whispered that if the walls started caving in, I needed to find the mirror logs completely disconnected from the main corporate grid. And then she pushed through the ground floor exit and vanished into the bustling lobby. I opened my hand. The yellow paper contained 12 alphanumeric characters written in hurried black ink. I stayed late that evening. The towering glass building slowly emptied out until only the security guards and the night cleaning crews remained. I went down to the basement cafeteria to grab a black coffee. I was gone for exactly 15 minutes. When I returned to my temporary office, the heavy wooden door was fully shut, just as I had left it, but the atmosphere inside the room was distinctly wrong. The air felt disturbed. I walked behind my desk and looked down at the bottom right drawer. I always kept it locked with a small brass key. The lock was still engaged, but there were microscopic parallel scratch marks on the brass metal casing. Someone had picked it. I opened the drawer. The files were all there. My laptop was sitting untouched on the desk. My purse was completely ignored. But the manila folders containing my handwritten physical notes on the phantom logistics companies were slightly misaligned. The top edge of the folders used to be perfectly flush. Now they were staggered by a fraction of an inch. Whoever came into my office did not want to steal anything of monetary value. They wanted intelligence. They wanted to know exactly how much poison I had managed to pull out of the corporate bloodstream. The hunter had officially become the hunted within the sterile, polite walls of my own family business. The real strike happened the very next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I received a brief calendar invite from my father's executive assistant. It requested my immediate presence in the primary boardroom on the 10th floor. The subject line simply read, Family Operational Alignment. It sounded like a standard mediated conversation to clear the air about my network access issues. It sounded like an attempt to smooth over the rough edges over morning coffee. I walked into the massive glass-walled room, expecting a tense but civil dialogue. Instead, I walked into an execution chamber. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table. His face was entirely drawn and pale gray. My mother sat next to him with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Nolan sat on the opposite side, looking somber and deeply troubled, and sitting at the far end of the table was Marcus Vance. He was the senior litigation partner for the external corporate law firm retained by Westhaven. He did not look up when I entered. He was busy aligning the edges of a massive thick stack of legal documents. Nobody offered me a seat. Nobody asked how my morning was going. Marcus Vance simply slid the heavy stack of paper across the smooth, polished wood until it stopped directly in front of me. He told me the board had uncovered severe internal irregularities directly tied to my user credentials. I looked down at the documents. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of fabricated evidence. The first page was a drafted addendum attempting to permanently alter the voting rights of the executive board heavily in my favor. The second document was a proposed restructuring order for the Crawford Family Trust designed to sideline my brother entirely. But the most devastating pieces of paper were the printed internal email threads. They were meticulously forged conversations between my email address and external legal counsel. The emails discussed my father's failing health in cold clinical terms. They outlined a strategic plan to declare him medically unfit to govern the company. They painted a picture of a woman coldly calculating the exact moment her father would be too weak to fight back, so she could seize total executive control without firing a single shot. The trap was not just designed to fire me. A simple termination would have caused too many questions. It would have left me free to take my findings to the state authorities or the federal regulators. This trap was designed to completely obliterate my personal and professional credibility. The architect of this nightmare had studied my entire life with surgical precision. They took my independent nature, my physical distance from the family over the last 15 years, and my strict, unemotional professional demeanor, and they wove all those true elements into a horrifying, beautiful lie. The story laid out in those forged documents made perfect, terrifying sense to anyone on the outside looking in. I was the bitter oldest child. I was the angry daughter who watched her younger brother get groomed for the throne while I was cast aside. I had supposedly returned home not to help heal the company, but to extract my ultimate revenge and take the empire by force while the king was bleeding out on the operating table. I looked at my father. I saw the absolute devastation and profound betrayal in his sunken eyes. I looked at my mother. She was shaking silently, refusing to even meet my gaze. They believed it. They actually believed every single forged word printed on those crisp white pages. In that freezing silent boardroom, I realized the sheer magnitude of the pure evil I was facing. The person who built this trap did not just want to push me out of the building to protect his stolen millions. He wanted to turn me into a monster. He wanted to create a narrative so logically sound and emotionally resonant that my own flesh and blood would willingly pick up the heavy shovel to bury me alive. I was standing dead center in the middle of a burning room, and the person who struck the match was sitting right across the table wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a mask of profound brotherly sorrow. I looked at the massive stack of forged documents resting on the polished mahogany table. I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy binders across the room. I simply looked directly into the tired eyes of the man who raised me. I told my father in a perfectly calm and steady voice that I had absolutely nothing to do with those files. I told him I never authorized a single change to the family trust, and I never attempted to alter the executive voting rights. I waited for him to search my face. I waited for him to look past the ink and the paper and see the daughter he had known for 39 years. He did not ask me a single question. He did not ask me why the digital access logs looked so strange, or why the language in the emails did not sound like me. He just kept his eyes locked firmly on the printed corporate letterhead. In his mind, the crisp white paper was an undeniable physical truth. The complex digital signatures and the neat printed paragraphs were far more reliable than my flesh and blood. It was a profound and deeply quiet devastation. I realized in that exact moment that the foundation of our entire family was built on nothing but fragile glass. I shifted my gaze to my mother. She was sitting rigidly next to him. Her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. For one brief, agonizing second, I saw a flicker of genuine doubt cross her face. She opened her mouth and took a short breath, as if she was about to demand a pause in the madness. She wanted to believe me. The maternal instinct to protect her child was fighting desperately against the overwhelming mountain of fabricated evidence sitting on the table. But my younger brother was watching her closely. Nolan recognized that microscopic hesitation instantly, and he moved to crush it before it could take root. He leaned forward and placed his warm hand gently over her shaking fingers. He spoke in a voice that was thick with perfectly manufactured sorrow. He did not raise his voice or sound angry. He sounded like a heartbroken son, trying to gently guide his confused mother through a terrible tragedy. He carefully explained the technical routing protocols and the digital timestamps in a way that made the highly complex data sound like simple, undeniable facts. He spun a brilliant narrative about how I had always resented the family business, and how I had finally found the perfect moment to strike while our father was weak. I watched him expertly transform my mother's raw panic into a solid wall of misplaced trust. Her shoulders slumped. She pulled her hand away from mine and stared down at her lap, refusing to look at me ever again. The trap was fully closed, and Marcus Vance was ready to lock the heavy steel door. The senior corporate counsel cleared his throat and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a man who destroys careers for a living. He informed the room that the executive board had a strict fiduciary obligation to protect the financial assets of the corporation and its shareholders. He stated that the severity of the forged documents left them with absolutely no choice. He formally recommended turning the entire fabricated dossier over to the state civil investigators and the regional criminal fraud division. He was deliberately transforming an internal family dispute into a massive public legal catastrophe. He asked my father for official authorization to proceed with the legal filings. My father did not speak. He simply offered a single slow nod of his head. He had just sentenced his own daughter to complete professional and personal ruin without uttering a single word. The execution was immediate and ruthless. Marcus Vance demanded my corporate mobile phone. He demanded my security access badge and the silver metal keys to my office. Two large men in dark gray suits stepped out from the shadows near the heavy wooden doors. They were private corporate security contractors. They instructed me to stand up and walk towards the elevators. I was not allowed to return to my desk alone. They marched me down the long, pristine hallways of the executive floor. We walked past rows of open cubicles and glass-walled conference rooms. The entire floor fell completely silent. Dozens of employees stopped typing and stared at me. I could feel the intense heat of their judgment burning into my skin. I kept my head perfectly straight, and my eyes focused completely forward. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The security guards escorted me through the massive marble lobby and pushed open the heavy glass front doors. They watched me walk to my car to ensure I actually left the property. I was banished from the empire my own parents had built, and I was cast out exactly like a common thief in the middle of a bright Tuesday afternoon. The fallout was incredibly fast and entirely merciless. Within 48 hours, the local business journals smelled the blood in the water. The digital headlines were completely savage. They painted me as the ultimate corporate villain. The articles described a greedy and bitter daughter who tried to systematically steal the family logistics empire while her sick father was fighting for his life in intensive care. The social isolation hit me like a massive concrete wall. People I had known for over a decade completely vanished. Former colleagues from my previous consulting firm, sent me vague, uncomfortable text messages saying they were very sorry to hear the news, but they could not be publicly associated with me right now. My closest friends suddenly stopped returning my calls, but the most excruciating pain came from my own blood. I drove to my parents' large brick house on the edge of the city. The heavy iron gates at the end of their driveway were firmly locked. I called their private home phone line exactly 5 times over the course of 3 days. Every single call went directly to a sterile automated voicemail. They had completely erased me from their lives. They truly believed every single lie my brother had carefully planted in their minds. I spent the next several days sitting alone in the dark living room of my temporary leased apartment. I watched the shadows move slowly across the bare white walls. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was a heavy physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had lost my entire career. I had lost my spotless professional reputation. I had lost the only family I had ever known. I was entirely alone in the ruins of my own life. On the evening of the 4th day, I heard a very soft scratching sound coming from the front entryway. I walked quietly to the door and looked down at the hardwood floor. Someone had pushed a thick brown manila envelope under the heavy wooden doorframe. There was no return address printed on the outside. There were no postal stamps. I picked up the envelope and tore open the thick paper. 2 items fell out into my hand. The first was a blank white plastic electronic access card. It had no corporate logo and no magnetic strip, just an embedded internal chip. The second item was a small piece of cheap yellow ruled paper, torn roughly from a standard legal pad. The handwriting was jagged and hurried. I recognized the sharp, slanted letters immediately. It was a message from Lena Morales, the woman who had tried to warn me about the corrupted digital ledgers before completely vanishing into thin air. The note contained only one single sentence. It told me that if they decided to take me to court, I needed to make sure I did not speak too soon. I sat down on the edge of my sofa and stared at the yellow paper for a very long time. It is a fundamental human instinct to scream the truth when you are backed into a corner. When you are falsely accused of a terrible crime, your first reaction is to yell and fight and desperately try to force people to see the truth. But I knew exactly who I was fighting. Nolan was an absolute master of controlling the narrative. If I started screaming to the press or fighting wildly in the open, he would simply use my aggressive behavior to prove that I was emotionally unstable and incredibly dangerous. If I tried to defend myself too early, he would know exactly what pieces of evidence I possessed, and he would systematically destroy them before I could ever build a solid case. The note from Lena was a lifeline in the absolute dark. It was a strategic directive from a ghost. I made a choice in that dark, silent room. I decided to bury my natural instincts. I decided to completely embrace the heavy, crushing silence. I would not release a defensive public statement. I would not hire a loud, aggressive public relations firm to fight the terrible articles. I would let my brother believe his trap had worked perfectly. I would let him think I was totally broken and completely defeated. I needed him to feel totally safe and completely secure in his stolen victory. While he was busy celebrating his massive triumph and counting his stolen millions, I would take the blank white card and step quietly into the deep shadows. I was no longer the falsely accused daughter trying to clear her name. I was a professional investigator who had just found the very first piece of the true puzzle. I was going to find the woman who disappeared on the exact same day my family decided to point their guns at my chest. And when I finally found her, I was going to pull the entire rotting company down directly on top of my brother's head. Naomi Bell met me at a desolate industrial park on the outskirts of the city at exactly 11 o'clock at night. She wore a heavy dark trench coat and carried a specialized encrypted laptop tightly under her arm. Naomi was a shark in a tailored suit. She was a defense attorney who specialized in catastrophic corporate litigation, and she did not believe in coincidence. I handed her the blank white plastic card I found under my door. We walked in complete silence toward an unmarked heavy metal door belonging to a third-party off-site data storage facility. We swiped the blank card. The heavy lock clicked open with a sharp mechanical snap. Inside the aggressively chilled server room, the air hummed with raw electrical power. Naomi plugged her machine directly into the terminal designated by the alphanumeric serial number written on the yellow paper. The screen immediately flooded with endless streams of raw hexadecimal code. Naomi parsed the fragmented data logs for 3 solid hours while I stood watch by the exit. What we found hidden in the digital architecture was essentially a ghost in the machine. The primary digital signature system of the company had a dark shadow. There was a parallel mirror server actively operating completely outside the main corporate firewall. The recovered logs definitively proved that secure executive authorizations were being systematically duplicated and executed from a remote, unverified location. But the data was heavily fragmented and intentionally corrupted. It showed the what and the where, but it completely lacked the who. We had absolute technical proof of a cloned authentication system, but zero concrete evidence connecting my brother to its creation or connecting the forged signatures directly to his fingers. In the harsh eyes of a civil court judge, it was just a highly suspicious technical anomaly. It was a circumstantial puzzle piece. It was not a silver bullet capable of stopping a moving train. We desperately needed the architect. We needed the woman who built the hidden back door. Early the next morning, I drove across town to the residential address listed in the old employee directory for Lena Morales. It was a modest brick building located in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. I knocked on the wooden door of apartment number 4 for 10 straight minutes. There was no answer. The door across the hall eventually creaked open. The building manager stepped out. He was a tired-looking man holding a stained coffee mug. He told me the girl in number 4 was completely gone. He said she packed a single black duffel bag and ran out of the building like the devil himself was chasing her exactly 2 nights ago. She left her heavy wooden furniture, her television, and her winter coats hanging in the closet. She left a sealed envelope containing 2 full months of rent in cold hard cash sitting right on the kitchen counter. People do not abandon their entire lives in the middle of the night unless staying means losing their life entirely. I drove back to my leased apartment and opened the encrypted hard drives I had carefully smuggled out before my abrupt termination. I spent the next 14 hours cross-referencing internal human resource payments with departmental communication logs. I had to find the exact trigger point that caused her to run. I finally found it buried deep inside a routine quarterly payroll reconciliation sheet. Lena had not just vanished randomly into the night. Exactly 48 hours before she submitted an abrupt request for a personal leave of absence, she had filed a critical severity incident report regarding the digital signature architecture. The internal system automatically routed that specific classification of technical failure directly to the senior financial officer, Nolan. My brother received her highly detailed report outlining the mirror server vulnerability. He did not forward it to the compliance department. He did not flag it for an external security review. He buried it completely. And then Lena disappeared. Nolan knew exactly what she had uncovered because she handed him the map directly. The pieces were rapidly clicking together, but the sheer magnitude of the operation still felt incomplete. Why go to such extreme lengths right now? Why frame your own sister and risk a massive federal fraud investigation just to protect a few $1 million in fake consulting fees? Nolan was greedy, but he was not stupid. He needed a much bigger prize to justify this level of catastrophic operational risk. Naomi called me on a secure burner phone at 5 o'clock the following afternoon. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight and urgent. She told me to look at the financial newswires immediately. Harbor Slate Capital. They were a massive predatory private equity firm based out of New York. They had just announced an expedited aggressive timeline to purchase a 49% controlling stake in West Haven Relief Network. The proposed acquisition price was staggering. If the merger successfully went through, the entire corporate structure would be dissolved and completely rebuilt from the ground up. The existing digital ledgers would be archived and permanently sealed under ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The millions of dollars stolen through the phantom logistics companies would be completely washed and legalized through the complex post-merger equity restructuring. The dirty money would instantly become clean, untraceable corporate capital. The truth hit me with the overwhelming force of a runaway freight train. I was never the main target of his wrath. I was simply an incredibly inconvenient obstacle that arrived at the worst possible moment in time. I was brought in to clean up the books right when Nolan was desperately trying to finalize the biggest financial crime of his entire life. The private equity buyers required flawless compliance audits before they would sign the final massive checks. They required every single executive signature to be completely authenticated and verified. Nolan needed the phantom ledgers to look absolutely pristine. He needed my father completely incapacitated and out of the way. He needed every single doubting mouth permanently silenced. When I started asking questions about the routing optimization fees and the external storage vendors, I threatened to blow up a 9-figure acquisition. I was not taken down just because I was asking questions. I was taken down because I was standing directly on top of the escape hatch, holding a bright flashlight. Naomi did not stop digging through the legal dirt. She used her extensive network of federal judicial contacts to search the blind court dockets across multiple jurisdictions. Late Thursday night, she found a heavily redacted filing in a federal district court located 3 states away. It was a formal application for federal whistleblower protection, submitted under a sealed alias exactly 3 weeks ago. The timeline matched Lena perfectly. The jurisdiction matched the physical location of the cloud corporate servers managing the West Haven digital infrastructure. Lena was not running from the law in a blind panic. She was actively hiding inside its protective armor. She knew Nolan would come for her the exact moment she refused to permanently delete the system logs. So she gathered her proof, packed her single bag, and handed herself over to the federal authorities before my brother could arrange a convenient fatal traffic accident. She was completely off the grid and totally untouchable. Naomi sat across from me at a small wooden table in a dimly lit diner on the edge of the county line. She laid out the harsh mathematical reality of our current situation. We had the fragmented data logs proving the system was rigged. We had the true motive wrapped up neatly in a massive private equity buyout. We had a missing network administrator seeking federal protection. But we still did not have a single piece of direct, undeniable evidence that could survive the brutal scrutiny of a high-profile civil trial. If I took this fragmented story to the state investigators right now, Nolan would simply hire an army of expensive crisis management publicists. He would smoothly claim the mirror server was a standard, unapproved backup protocol created by a rogue employee. He would paint Lena as a disgruntled worker who suffered a severe mental breakdown. He would use my own desperate, aggressive behavior to reinforce the false narrative that I was a bitter, unstable woman trying to destroy my family out of pure spite. I would be crushed instantly and the massive corporate merger would sail through without a single problem. There was only one alternative path forward. It was a path that required swallowing my pride and accepting a profound, agonizing public humiliation. I had to let the local media continue to drag my name through the thick mud. I had to let my parents continue to look at me with absolute disgust and heartbreak. I had to let Nolan believe he had successfully destroyed me and won the entire game. I had to remain completely silent and absorb the heavy, terrible blows until the exact moment the trial began. I had to wait patiently until the trap was so fully sprung in open court that my brother could not take a single step backward. Only then could we force the hidden survivor to step out of the shadows and into the blinding light. The truth is a very strange and resilient thing. It does not simply vanish when a powerful person tries to kill it. It just runs away and hides, waiting for the perfect moment to return and burn your entire world to the ground. I chose to wait in the dark. 10 days before the civil trial was scheduled to violently consume my life, the suffocating silence was finally broken. Marcus Vance sent a secure private courier directly to the downtown legal office of Naomi Bell. The heavy sealed envelope did not contain standard trial exhibits or routine legal discovery documents. It contained a formal settlement offer printed on ultra-premium corporate letterhead. The proposed terms were brutally simple and incredibly insulting. If I agreed to sign a permanent ironclad non-disclosure agreement, officially renounce every single one of my legal rights to the Crawford Family Trust, and quietly drop any unspoken grievances against the executive board, they would miraculously consider settling the entire matter out of court. They promised to withdraw the pending criminal referrals and allow me to walk away into the shadows with a fraction of my professional dignity completely intact. They gave us exactly 24 hours to respond to the ultimatum. Naomi slid the heavy parchment paper across her expansive desk. We both stared at the crisp black ink detailing my total surrender. It was not a genuine olive branch extended by a merciful family. It was a massive glaring neon sign, broadcasting pure, unadulterated panic. Corporate predators who hold a truly unbeatable hand do not suddenly offer you a quiet exit through the back door right before the final highly publicized showdown. Nolan was terrified. He was not afraid of the brilliant fabricated evidence he had meticulously created to frame me. He was deathly afraid that I was secretly holding on to a single loose thread that could unravel his entire 9-figure corporate acquisition. He wanted to completely erase my existence from the family tree before I could pull that specific dangerous brick out of his carefully constructed wall. He needed absolute certainty before the private equity buyers signed the final checks. While we sat dissecting the insulting settlement offer, one of Naomi's independent forensic investigators returned with a separate, deeply buried financial dossier. He had been quietly running parallel asset checks on the primary corporate credit lines, searching for any hidden weaknesses. What his team uncovered made the blood completely freeze in my veins. The financial rot was not just contained within the massive corporate boundaries of West Haven Relief Network. The investigator had pulled deeply redacted property records and obscure municipal loan guarantees from 3 different counties. A significant and terrifying portion of my parents' personal estate had been quietly leveraged without their knowledge. The sprawling brick house they had lived in for 40 years and the private retirement portfolios they had spent their entire lives aggressively building were explicitly listed as primary collateral. Those highly personal assets were actively securing massive high-interest bridge loans directly tied to the phantom logistics shell companies we had discovered earlier. I sat in the hard leather chair in Naomi's office feeling completely nauseated by the sheer scale of the betrayal. Leonard and Diane Crawford were entirely unaware that they were standing on the absolute edge of total financial ruin. My father was a staunch traditionalist who fiercely protected his personal assets. He despised unnecessary debt. He would never in a million years gamble his wife's home to secure a generic operational warehouse loan. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. My parents were not just my bitter accusers sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom. They were the primary victims being blindly led to the slaughter by the exact same golden son they implicitly trusted with their lives. Nolan was actively gutting their entire legacy and preparing to leave them completely destitute, while smiling warmly at them across the Sunday dinner table. Naomi leaned heavily against the edge of her wooden desk and poured herself a glass of water. The harsh fluorescent office lights cast deep, exhausted shadows across her sharp face. She told me I needed to immediately prepare my mind for the absolute worst-case scenario. The trial was only 72 hours away. The local jury pool had been relentlessly saturated by weeks of terrible, highly sensationalized media coverage. The public thoroughly believed the tragic cinematic narrative of the greedy outcast daughter trying to forcefully steal the kingdom from her dying father. Naomi warned me that a civil jury would be intensely swayed by the raw emotional sight of my frail father and my weeping mother testifying under oath. Cold logic and obscure digital timestamp discrepancies rarely win against the visceral, agonizing power of a heartbroken parent crying on the witness stand. Furthermore, our entire counteroffensive relied completely on a terrified federal whistleblower who was entirely off the grid. If Lena Morales did not physically walk through those heavy courtroom doors, I would be completely and utterly annihilated by the legal system. That same night, I sat perfectly still on the cold floor of my dark apartment. The streetlights from the busy avenue below cast long yellow shadows across the blank white ceiling. The silence in the room was absolute and crushing. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my prepaid, untraceable burner phone buzzed violently against the hardwood floor. I answered the call immediately without saying a single word. The connection was incredibly thick with heavy digital static and the distinct muffled echo of a large public transit station. A sharp, familiar voice cut through the harsh background noise. It was Lena. She spoke incredibly fast. Her words were sharp, breathless, and completely devoid of any soft emotion. She told me she was alive, and she was currently being held in a secure, undisclosed location by the federal authorities. She said she knew the high-profile trial was starting in a matter of days. Her instructions to me were brief and absolutely uncompromising. She told me not to flinch under the pressure. She told me not to break the rhythm, no matter how brutal the opening days of the trial became. Before I could ask her a single question, she delivered the final devastating piece of the puzzle. She told me the illegal mirror server, hidden completely outside the corporate firewall, was not just designed to copy my digital footprint and frame me for the takeover. The phantom server had another far more sinister primary function. Nolan had used the exact same illegal architecture to completely reconstruct the highly secure biometric signature of our father. Every single one of those massive personal loan documents leveraging my parents' private estate was authenticated with a mathematically perfect forgery of Leonard Crawford's digital identity. Nolan had systematically forged his own sick father's signature to feed millions of dollars into his dummy shell companies, knowing perfectly well that the inevitable default would cost his parents everything they owned. The encrypted phone line went completely dead, leaving only a flat dial tone. I held the silent plastic phone tightly in my hand as the true horrifying scope of my brother's endgame crystallized perfectly in my mind. The stakes of the upcoming legal battle had just skyrocketed, far past my own personal survival. If I lost the civil case, I would not just lose my professional honor and face potential federal prison time for corporate fraud. I would become the ultimate perfect sacrificial lamb. My complete public destruction would provide Nolan with the flawless, ironclad cover story he desperately needed. He would use the massive influx of private equity buyout money to quietly patch the bleeding holes in the corporate ledger and erase the fraudulent loans. He would leave our parents completely hollowed out, entirely stripped of their dignity, and totally dependent on his manufactured mercy for the rest of their natural lives. I was no longer just fighting to clear my own name from a vicious, fabricated lie. I was the very last standing firewall protecting my parents from being completely destroyed by the monster they had unknowingly raised in their own home. I placed the phone gently on the floor and watched the deep blue dawn slowly begin to rise over the city skyline. I was absolutely ready for the war to begin. The trial began exactly on the second Monday of November. The prosecution opened their case with a brutal and highly polished efficiency. They constructed a fortress of paper around me that looked absolutely impenetrable. Marcus Vance stood before the jury box and laid out his grand narrative. He presented the digital access logs authenticated by the internal systems specialist of the company. He introduced the forged family trust addendums. He assigned me a motive so ancient and believable, it felt like a classic tragedy. I was the overlooked firstborn child driven to madness by decades of quiet resentment. When Nolan finally took the witness stand, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He wore a slightly rumpled gray suit to project an image of exhaustion and relentless dedication. He kept his voice low and respectful. He did not sound angry. He sounded profoundly broken. He told the jury he had spent the last 30 days sleeping on a small cot in his office, just trying to keep the emergency supply chains running while our father was fighting for his life. He looked directly at the jury and swore under oath that he only wanted to save the company for our parents. He painted himself as the loyal guardian of the family legacy, desperately trying to hold the crumbling walls together while his own sister planted explosives in the basement. Vance then directed the attention of the court to a massive white projector screen pulled down over the oak paneling. He displayed a highly detailed chain of internal emails. The timestamps indicated they were sent late at night during the exact weeks my father was in the intensive care unit. The emails were sent from my official corporate address to an external legal consulting firm. The language on the screen was aggressive and chillingly calculated. The digital version of me demanded immediate structural revisions to the executive voting rights. The digital version of me explicitly stated that the current leadership was physically compromised and completely unfit to manage the upcoming private equity negotiations. I sat rigidly at the defense table and watched the jury read my supposed words. I could practically hear the heavy wooden doors of a federal prison cell slamming shut in their minds. I looked like a woman who had eagerly typed out her own legal death sentence. Then my father was called to testify. Leonard Crawford walked slowly to the wooden box. His testimony was the deepest cut of the entire morning. Vance gently guided him through the history of our family dynamic. He asked my father if he had ever considered passing the ultimate executive control of the company to me. My father looked down at his trembling hands. He told the silent courtroom that he had thought about it many years ago. He said I was undeniably brilliant with financial structuring and risk assessment, but then he looked up and stared directly into my eyes. His voice was entirely hollow. He told the jury he ultimately decided against me because I was simply too cold. He said I lacked the fundamental human empathy required to lead a company built on saving lives. That single phrase hung in the frozen air of the courtroom. Too cold. It was a perfectly executed emotional assassination. It completely destroyed whatever thin shred of sympathy the jury might have held for me. They no longer saw a brilliant auditor. They saw a terrifying sociopath. My mother delivered the final devastating blow right after the midday recess. Diane Crawford did not bother holding back her tears. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand and wept openly as she described the sheer terror of discovering the unauthorized asset transfers. Vance asked her about the specific authorization documents. She raised her head and swore to the court that she had personally reviewed the digital transfer orders. She choked on her own words as she told the jury she saw the unmistakable electronic signature of her own daughter stamped at the bottom of the pages. Her raw, agonizing grief instantly shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. We were no longer debating complex network architecture or technical timestamp discrepancies. We were witnessing a profound moral atrocity. The jury stopped taking notes and simply glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Through all of this, Naomi Bell sat beside me and played an incredibly dangerous game of restraint. During her cross-examinations, she only chipped away at the absolute edges of their arguments. She asked the internal systems specialist a few highly technical questions about remote server access, but she did not aggressively challenge his ultimate conclusions. She asked my brother about the exact timing of his network security audits, but she did not accuse him of perjury. She deliberately kept her sword sheathed. Her passive strategy infuriated the few remaining spectators who had shown up hoping to see a fight. I could hear the aggressive whispers from the gallery behind me. Even the local reporters looked completely baffled by our apparent surrender. It looked exactly like we were willingly letting ourselves drown in the rising tide of their evidence. I did not react. I did not shake my head in denial when my brother lied. I did not flinch when my father called me a monster. I did not look away when my mother cried. I maintained a posture so entirely still and a facial expression so completely blank that I knew it made me look incredibly arrogant. I knew the entire room despised my silence. They wanted me to break down. They wanted me to scream or beg for forgiveness so the narrative could be perfectly complete. But my profound silence began to create a very strange and uncomfortable vacuum in the room. The absolute certainty of the prosecution began to feel slightly hollow against my total lack of panic. I sat there like a woman who knew a terrible secret that no one else in the room could even begin to comprehend. The heavy wooden clock on the back wall ticked closer to 5 in the evening. The first day of the trial was drawing to a close. Vance was wrapping up his incredibly damaging emotional summary. He was preparing to rest his initial case and leave the jury with the image of my weeping mother burning in their minds. But just as he opened his mouth to request an adjournment for the day, the heavy side doors of the courtroom swung open. The head bailiff walked rapidly down the center aisle. He bypassed the prosecution table entirely and went straight to the elevated bench. He handed a thick red folder directly to the presiding judge. The room fell into a sudden suffocating silence. The judge opened the folder and read the single sheet of paper inside. His jaw tightened instantly. He looked over the rim of his reading glasses and stared directly at Marcus Vance. He announced to the court that he had just received an emergency federal notice. A highly protected witness directly tied to the fundamental digital authentication chain of the primary evidence was currently en route to the courthouse. The witness was being transported under a severe civil protection order, and their testimony would be immediately added to the official docket for the following morning. Panic is a very quiet thing when it first strikes a powerful man. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at the jury. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at my brother. Nolan was still sitting near the prosecution table. His perfect mask of sorrow completely evaporated in a fraction of a second. His skin turned the color of old ash. He knew exactly what that federal notice meant. He knew the ghost he thought he had buried was currently riding in the back of an armored government vehicle heading straight for his throat. The walls of his perfect, magnificent lie were about to violently cave in, and I was finally going to watch him burn. The judge ordered a mandatory recess for 1 hour, while he reviewed the sudden emergency filings in his private chambers. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, and the stifling tension in the room instantly shattered into a chaotic buzz of frantic whispers. The gallery erupted. The reporters sprinted for the heavy double doors to call their editors. I remained completely still at the defense table. Naomi was rapidly sorting through her thick manila folders, preparing the final trap. I stood up and walked out into the wide marble hallway to breathe the cool, recirculated air. The corridor was packed with lawyers in dark suits and spectators speaking in hushed, rapid tones. I found a quiet corner near the towering glass windows overlooking the city skyline. That was when Nolan found me. He abandoned his legal team and walked directly toward my isolated corner. He did not look like the grieving, heartbroken brother anymore. The carefully constructed mask of righteous sorrow completely melted away the second we were out of earshot of the press. His eyes were completely flat, and his jaw was locked tight. He stopped just inches away from me, invading my physical space with a sudden burst of raw, predatory aggression. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a vicious, quiet hiss that barely carried over the ambient noise of the crowded hallway. He told me I needed to stop this reckless crusade right this exact second. He warned me that I had absolutely no idea who else I was dragging into the grave with me. That single calculated threat revealed the sheer massive scale of his desperation. He was no longer just trying to protect his own stolen wealth. He was actively trying to contain a massive, catastrophic explosion that threatened to completely incinerate the executive board, annihilate our parents' financial future, and completely vaporize the massive private equity buyout. He wanted me to back down because he knew the impending federal testimony would not just expose his elaborate forgery, it would trigger a chain reaction of total destruction. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and did not say a single word. I simply offered him a very slow and incredibly cold smile. When we finally returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The absolute certainty that had previously anchored the prosecution table was entirely gone. I sat down next to Naomi and glanced across the aisle at my family. I noticed a profound, subtle change in my mother. Diane Crawford was staring blankly at the dark wooden grain of the table in front of her. Her hands were no longer clasped in quiet prayer. They were nervously twisting a small white tissue into absolute shreds. I knew exactly what was haunting her. During the morning session, Nolan had confidently testified about his precise whereabouts on the second Tuesday of October. He swore under oath that he was working late at the corporate headquarters, desperately managing the broken supply chain. But my mother possessed a razor-sharp memory for medical timelines. She knew for an absolute fact that Nolan was sitting right next to her in the cardiac intensive care waiting room on that exact Tuesday night, drinking terrible black coffee. The timeline was completely fractured. The brilliant narrative he had spun for the jury contained a fatal chronological flaw, and my mother had just stumbled blindly over it. I watched her look slowly at my brother and then look over at me. A raw, terrifying realization was beginning to bloom behind her eyes. She was finally brushing up against the horrific possibility that she had chosen to believe the wrong child. But the sheer psychological weight of that truth was simply too heavy for her to bear. She squeezed her eyes shut and forcefully buried the doubt deep down inside her chest. The heavy side doors opened and the judge returned to the elevated bench. The room instantly fell dead silent. Naomi immediately stood up and formally submitted the petition to admit the late testimony of the federally protected witness. Marcus Vance sprang from his leather chair like a coiled snake. He was practically shouting as he launched a furious legal objection. He accused our defense team of orchestrating a desperate theatrical stunt designed purely to manufacture cheap drama and deliberately delay the inevitable verdict. He argued that allowing an unlisted surprise witness to testify at the 11th hour was a complete mockery of standard judicial procedure and highly prejudicial against his clients. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he demanded the judge throw the petition out and immediately proceed to closing arguments. The judge ignored the theatrical outrage pouring out of the lead prosecutor. He adjusted his silver reading glasses and opened the sealed federal affidavit Naomi had placed on the bench. The entire courtroom watched his face with absolute breathless anticipation. Judges who handle massive corporate civil trials are masters of maintaining a perfectly blank expression. But as he read the classified document, a very slight shift occurred. The deep lines around his mouth tightened. His posture became rigidly straight. He looked up from the paper and stared directly at Marcus Vance. The gallery collectively inhaled. That microscopic change in the judge's demeanor completely telegraphed the undeniable truth to everyone in the room. The person waiting in the secure holding area was not just a minor character witness or a disgruntled former employee. They carried the heavy, terrifying weight of the federal government behind them. At that exact moment, a new development silently unfolded in the back of the room. A tall man, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit, had been sitting in the very last row taking meticulous notes since the trial began. He was the senior risk assessment officer representing Harbor Slate Capital, the private equity firm waiting to buy our company. He abruptly stood up and walked out into the corridor. Through the small rectangular window in the heavy wooden doors, I watched him pull a sleek mobile phone from his pocket and make a rapid, urgent call. Less than 3 minutes later, the lead paralegal for the prosecution quietly slipped into the courtroom and handed a folded yellow note directly to Nolan. I watched my brother open the paper. Harbor Slate Capital had officially frozen the massive 9-figure acquisition. The private equity buyers were instantly terrified by the sudden involvement of a federal whistleblower. They halted all financial negotiations pending the immediate outcome of this specific testimony. The invincible armor my brother had worn for the last 6 months completely shattered in front of my eyes. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His hands began to shake so violently, he had to place them flat on the table to hide the tremors. The massive mountain of dirty money he thought he had successfully secured was rapidly burning to ash. My father was sitting right next to him. Leonard Crawford turned his head and saw the pure, unadulterated panic radiating from his golden son. He saw the shaking hands and the cold sweat forming on Nolan's forehead. Then my father slowly turned his head and looked across the wide aisle at me. I was sitting perfectly upright with my hands resting calmly in my lap. The absolute contrast between my serene silence and my brother's catastrophic physical collapse was impossible to ignore. The solid ground beneath my father's feet was violently breaking apart. The entire terrible truth was screaming at him in absolute silence. He was a brilliant man who had built an empire from nothing, but he was suddenly paralyzed by his own monumental failure as a parent. He realized the horrifying magnitude of what he had done to me, but he simply lacked the raw courage to stand up and retract his perjured testimony. He chose to remain frozen in his seat and watch the train violently derail. The judge slowly lowered the federal affidavit and placed it flat on the heavy wooden desk. He took off his silver reading glasses and placed them gently next to his wooden gavel. The silence in the massive room was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the large analog clock hanging on the back wall. Marcus Vance stood frozen at his podium, completely unsure of how to proceed. Nolan stared blankly ahead, looking like a man about to face a firing squad. My parents sat completely paralyzed in their heavy leather chairs. The entire terrible web of lies they had built to bury me was suspended by a single microscopic thread. The judge leaned forward slightly. He did not look at the prosecution. He did not look at the defense table. He shifted his gaze directly to the armed court bailiff, standing rigidly by the heavy reinforced side doors. He spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, incredibly deep, and completely devoid of any emotion. He pronounced the final 4 words very slowly, ensuring every single syllable echoed through the frozen air of the courtroom. "Bring in the witness." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. 2 large men wearing dark federal suits walked in first. Their eyes scanned the gallery with cold professional intensity. Walking perfectly straight between them was Lena Morales. The former senior data retention manager of West Haven Relief Network had not fled the country in a guilty panic. She walked down the center aisle wearing a sharp black suit. Her head was held high, and her jaw was set like absolute stone. The collective gasp from the corporate executives sitting behind the prosecution table was loud enough to echo off the high ceiling. Nolan looked like a man who had just been forcefully pushed out of an airplane without a parachute. He shrank back into his heavy leather chair. His brilliant, charismatic facade completely dissolved into raw animal terror. My parents stared at the woman walking toward the witness stand with utter confusion. They did not understand why a mid-level database manager required a federal security escort, but Marcus Vance knew. The lead prosecutor dropped his expensive gold pen onto the table, and it clattered loudly into the dead silence. Naomi Bell stood up and approached the podium with the calm, lethal grace of a tiger finally moving in for the kill. She established Lena on the record. She asked her about her specific access levels and her daily administrative responsibilities. Then Naomi asked the single question that brought the entire fake empire crashing down. She asked Lena who authorized the creation of the mirror server completely outside the primary corporate firewall. Lena leaned into the microphone. Her voice was incredibly steady and completely unwavering. She stated under absolute federal oath that Nolan Crawford had directly ordered her to build a secondary backup environment 6 months ago. He claimed it was a highly classified contingency plan for emergency executive continuity. He told her they needed a secure off-site system capable of perfectly cloning the digital authentication identities of the senior leadership team. He specifically requested the digital profiles of Faith Crawford and Leonard Crawford. Naomi pulled a massive stack of pristine printed server logs from her briefcase. She handed them to the court clerk. Lena verified them instantly as the original uncorrupted logs she had successfully smuggled out of the building on a physical hard drive. She explained to the jury that every single one of the digital signatures supposedly authorizing the hostile takeover and transferring the voting rights did not originate from my computer. She read the raw data aloud. The precise digital commands were all traced back to a specific Internet Protocol address located inside a vacant commercial warehouse. That specific warehouse was currently leased by a shell corporation exclusively controlled by my brother. The courtroom completely erupted. The judge struck his wooden gavel 4 times to restore basic order. But Naomi was not finished. She was determined to burn the entire corrupt structure all the way down to the foundation. She guided Lena to the most devastating revelation of the entire trial. Lena produced a series of heavily encrypted internal chat messages and handwritten sticky notes she had pulled directly from the private terminal in the office of my brother. The messages proved that Nolan was completely aware our father never signed a single piece of paper authorizing the massive personal loan guarantees. The notes contained explicit instructions detailing exactly how to use the cloned biometric signature to falsely secure millions of dollars in highly toxic debt against our parents' private residential estate. Nolan had deliberately engineered a plan to completely bankrupt his own mother and father just to quietly fund his phantom logistics companies. My mother let out a sharp, agonizing cry. It was the visceral, horrifying sound of a woman watching her entire universe violently collapse. Diane Crawford covered her face with both hands and began to shake uncontrollably. Leonard Crawford turned entirely gray. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his weak lungs. He stared at his golden son with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The perfect boy who had promised to save the family business had secretly wrapped a heavy chain of debt around their necks and confidently pushed them right off the edge of a cliff. Marcus Vance stood up on shaky legs to object, but the judge immediately ordered him to sit down. Naomi then asked Lena the final crucial question. She asked her why she completely disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving all her worldly possessions behind. Lena did not hesitate. She looked directly at Nolan. She told the court that she had firmly refused his direct order to permanently purge the mirror server logs. The very next morning, she found a printed copy of her ex-husband's confidential federal tax returns sitting on her desk. Later that afternoon, a mechanic informed her that the brake lines on her personal vehicle had been intentionally compromised. She realized she was dealing with a man who would gladly kill to protect his stolen fortune. She grabbed the encrypted hard drives and walked straight into the local office of the federal authorities to beg for civil witness protection. As a final definitive blow, Naomi displayed the damning emails that supposedly proved my ruthless ambition to steal the company. Lena expertly dissected the digital code right in front of the jury. She proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the threatening messages were entirely fabricated. Nolan had taken months of my highly mundane administrative emails regarding standard compliance reviews and brutally spliced the sentences together to create a terrifying false narrative. I was never planning a hostile takeover. I was simply doing my job. The atmosphere in the massive room underwent a violent total reversal. The meticulously crafted case against me completely evaporated into thin air. The prosecution table was in absolute total disarray. Marcus Vance was frantically whispering to his junior partners, realizing his prestigious career was suddenly tied to a massive federal fraud conspiracy. Nolan sat completely frozen, staring blankly at the dark wooden table. He had built a magnificent stage to execute me publicly, but Lena had just handed the heavy hangman rope directly to him. The presiding judge did not wait for closing arguments. He completely dismissed the civil lawsuit against me with extreme prejudice right from the bench. His voice boomed through the room with furious, righteous authority. He immediately referred the entire matter to the federal criminal prosecutor's office and officially ordered the state authorities to freeze every single financial asset connected to Nolan Crawford and his associated dummy corporations. My brother was no longer the tragic hero desperately trying to save a hospital supply chain. He was a cornered criminal who had burned his own sister alive at the stake just to hide the smoke from his own massive fires. I did not launch a dramatic hostile takeover in the aftermath. I did not seize the corporate throne out of some dark, twisted sense of greed or ambition. My revenge was incredibly precise and purely administrative. I used the absolute leverage of the court ruling to force the executive board to submit West Haven Relief Network to a brutal independent special audit. I permanently stripped Nolan of every single piece of his executive authority and banned him from the premises. I immediately froze the cheap 9-figure buyout from the private equity firm. And most importantly, I deployed my own forensic accounting team to aggressively sever the fraudulent high-interest loans from my parents' personal estate, ensuring they would not lose their home when the dummy corporations finally collapsed under federal scrutiny. 2 weeks later, I stood alone in the cold, empty marble lobby of the corporate headquarters. I was packing the last of my files into a single cardboard box. I heard slow, heavy footsteps echoing across the floor behind me. I turned around and saw my parents standing near the glass doors. They looked incredibly small and impossibly old. My father could barely look me in the eye. His hands were trembling as he quietly told me how deeply sorry he was. My mother was crying softly, begging me to come to the house for dinner so we could start healing our family. I looked at the two people who had so easily believed a mountain of beautiful lies over the daughter they had raised for 39 years. I did not scream at them. I did not cry. I simply held my cardboard box and told them the cold, absolute truth. I told them that knowing the truth was a wonderful thing because it had successfully saved me from spending 20 years in a federal prison cell. But I also told them that true foundational trust is not something you can instantly rebuild just by saying you are sorry. Trust is a heavy stone bridge that takes decades of hard work to construct, and they had willingly detonated it in a single afternoon. I wished them both good health. Then I turned around and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the bright, freezing afternoon air, leaving them standing completely alone in the silent, empty hall. Thank you so much for listening to this entire story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.